Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
At long last, the streak is over. But unfortunately, there's still a lot more work to be done when it comes to actually bringing a trophy or a banner to the rafters at Toyota Center. So to recap both of last week's NBA Cup knockout round games against the Warriors and Thunder, as well as storylines for what should be a weaker stretch of the schedule over the coming days, that's what we're going to be discussing today here at the Logger Line. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of the team. I'm joined by Paulo Alves, our co-host and producer out of Portugal. You can follow him on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA, and me on there at Ben Dubose. This show is again sponsored by Clutch City Lager of Karbach Brewing. Their beer developed in collaboration with the Rockets. You can follow Karbach on those same platforms at Karbach Brewing. So as we chat this Wednesday, December 18th, officially a week before Christmas, so happy holidays to all of you listening. It's definitely been a very interesting few days on the Houston sports scene. I'm not going to talk much about the Astros because, Jim Crane sheeping out on Kyle Tucker and maybe Alex Bregman as well, and the so-called golden era probably coming to a close. That's a different discussion for a lot of reasons. I just don't want to bum anybody out. But as far as the other two flagship franchises, if I was to say that the defense is already championship caliber, and we're just waiting on when or if the offense can get anywhere close to that level, I mean, you wouldn't know if I'm talking about the Rockets or the Texans, right? There's just so many parallels there when you look at not only the current status of the teams, but the moves and the timetable. Each franchise made the big move in calendar year 2023, bringing in Ime Udoka, head coach of the Rockets, D'Amico Ryans, head coach of the Texans. They each had a lot of financial flexibility. Draft capital brought in guys like C.J. Stroud, like Amen Thompson. And so 2023 was the pivot point to set them up for long-term success. They're on the front end on what should be a longer-term window of contention. And at least for the immediate future, though, I think the outlook is fairly similar for both in that it's a good season, but probably not going to be a great one based on relatively similar limitations. Paolo, I know you enjoy those crossword analogies. Do you see where I'm going with all that?
Yeah, actually, I made a tweet about exactly what you were saying. The little format with the handshake, and you see the Texans and the Rockets handshaking and saying, "Or our defense is carrying our offense right now." I think it's absolutely true, but I do think that they differ a little bit, actually, because only because I think it's very. I guess it's very easy to project both teams or their path going forward to improving on the other side of the ball, in this case, the offense. But I think as for the Texans, besides the offensive line, everything's already there, right? The hard parts to get right, I think, are already there. They already have the superstar talent. On the Rockets, I think there's probably way more ways to go towards getting the offense to be good enough. But as we've talked about before on the pod, the pathway is there. It's we need a star guard to shake loose, and it's a very clean fit. And there's protectable guys that are going to become available in the next 2 years, and it's a very clean fit in the sense of you don't really have to give up much to get a massive improvement on the offense, just because, and sadly so, just because of how terrible Jalen Green has been. And Fred VanVleet for that matter. I know we'll get into him in this pod. But it's very much, there's just a straight upgrade. There's very little compromise in the start straight for us. We have the extra assets. We have the extra picks. We have the disposable playing time, as I'll say, which is what Jalen's getting right now. It's a very clean swap. But actually, I guess I'll hit you with a counter. Which franchise's future would you buy into more between the Texans and Rockets right now?
I lean Rockets simply because there's more clarity. I think what's going to happen when CJ gets his second contract, which will be way more expensive, and just how elite is he? He's definitely very good, don't get me wrong, but is he truly in that Pat Mahomes tier? And can Nick Caserio build a contending roster around him when he is much more expensive? Not that it can't be done, but it is going to be more challenging as opposed to the Rockets. There's more of a clear path forward, not just in terms of the players, but the finances, the business in terms of, certainly we know what the second contracts for a lot of the core seven are going to look like. We can estimate the ballpark. But beyond that, if they don't develop the 1A alpha on a contending team from the core seven and they have to make a big trade, then they have the assets to do so. We know financially what it would look like. They have the means to get it done. And so it's just easier for me to project exactly what a contending roster for the Rockets would look like 3-4 years from now. Not that I'm down on the Texans. It's just there is a little bit of pressure in the here and now because you have that superstar QB, or what we want to be a superstar QB, on his first contract. And so, I was going to pose that same question to you, but I'll actually delay it a little bit. Which team do you think we're more excited about in June of 2025? Because as I say it, there's a compelling case, at least for me, that my perspective could change a little bit over the next few months. Now, as far as the case for the Rockets, again, I think a lot of that just comes down to assets, finances, and the reality that they have not really cashed in their chips yet. Not that the Texans are in cap hell, but honestly, what makes this season all the more frustrating, they do have a great defense, but the biggest weakness on this Texans team that's held them back is the offensive line. They have invested a lot on the offensive line. They have pushed their chips not entirely in, but a lot of the way in. And so the fact that you're still having some of these issues, it is fair to wonder about Nick Caserio, D'Amico Ryans. Not that you need to replace them, absolutely not. But when the margin of error gets squeezed a ton, when CJ becomes way more expensive a few years from now, can they get that done? And so the Rockets, again, it's just a much more clear path. Obviously, plan A is you develop the alpha internally through all these core prospects, or at least some of them taking a leap. But if that doesn't happen, then we know the big trade that is potentially coming down the line. They have set themselves up well for that. We've talked about that ad nauseum when it comes to this pod and what the options are for the Rockets moving forward. I'm sure we'll do it in future episodes as well. And then, in terms of this season, I don't think I'm going to feel that much worse about the Rockets no matter what, because everything this year is basically house money. We know the timeline for the Rockets is, as you said, Paolo, a little bit further back. The thing with the Texans is that because of that first contract pressure, which is there with CJ Stroud, wasn't really there a year ago because obviously they didn't know he'd be good, or at least this good this soon. But they knew going into this offseason, that's why they brought in Joe Mixon. That's part of why they've continued to invest in the offensive line. They have a lot of veterans. And so if it doesn't work out this year, that's one of your cheap years with CJ. And so I would, if they don't do much in the playoffs, let's say they go out in the wild card round, or they lose in Kansas City in the divisional round and they don't look that competitive, then yeah, I might feel a little bit worse because they actually have invested a lot. As opposed to the Rockets, they don't have that much invested in this season. So no matter what happens, assuming they get to the playoffs, assuming they stay relatively healthy, knock on wood, I don't really think there's anything that could happen short of maybe, a sweep in which you lose by like 20, 25 points a game, something ridiculous, to where I would dramatically feel different about this team or this season. With the Texans, there is more variability. There's more volatility. And if this season doesn't go well, then the calculus of how you build out the rest of your team around CJ Stroud, not just in the short term, but 2-3 years from now, once he gets way more expensive, it's just a lot more complicated. And so there's more pressure. That's what I would say on the Texans, because, a stud QB just has much more of a correlation to winning than the current young guys on the Rockets, even if you factor in Alperen Şengün, who's still playing at a near all-star level. So there's a sense of urgency on the here and now with the Texans that isn't there with the Rockets. And so because of that, there's the possibility for better or for worse that I could feel pretty differently about the Texans in a month or so. But the counter to that, and it's why I'm sort of leaving the door open to all of a sudden feeling better about the Texans. It's so much easier to catch lightning in a bottle in the NFL than it is in the NBA, at least with the playoffs. And especially if you have an elite quarterback. Because, the counter to everything I was saying, no matter what the Rockets do, and even if they are playing their best ball come April and May, it's really tough to see this year's Rockets, assuming there's no big trade, having what it takes to beat an Oklahoma City or a Boston, a team in the true top tier of the NBA, 4 times out of 7 in the playoffs. Your flaws just get exposed because the bar is just so damn high. The sample is big enough that fluky things generally don't happen. But in the NFL, way crazier things have happened than a team with big-time playmakers like C.J. Stroud, like Nico Collins, like Joe Mixon, like Tank Dell, that has an elite defense as well. If all those guys are healthy and clicking at the same time, way crazier things have happened than a team like that putting it all together, finding the right chemistry, and going on a run come January. That's sort of the beauty and the curse of the NFL and this one-game winner-take-all format for every postseason round. And then if the Texans get the 4th seed, which it appears they're likely to get again as the winners of the AFC South, but the weakest division, you do get a home wildcard game, and they're in that spot right now. So if the status quo holds, you get a home wildcard game. They already showed last year that they're capable of winning in that environment. NRG Stadium is pretty crazy in the playoffs. And then you'd probably draw the Chiefs in the divisional round. And I know the Chiefs are the Chiefs, but they've been insanely lucky all year. Every metric shows that. And now you've got a gimpy Patrick Mahomes. Not saying I would pick the Texans to win in that spot if they meet the Chiefs in the divisional round, but it's not crazy. That's all I'm saying. So, Paolo, I think right now I would lean to the Rockets, but I'm curious what you think you'll think, not just in the here and now, but 6 months from now, once both postseason runs are over and we're looking to next season, which is certainly in the Rockets' case, a much more realistic window to actually think about contending. Which team do you think we're going to be more bullish on then?
So since you said June next year, I'm actually going to go with the Texans. And
Okay.
listen, forgive me if I say, just this for the audience, forgive me if I say anything that's completely out of line, because as you guys know, I'm getting into the NFL. I do consume a lot of content about it. But I think it will probably be the Texans, because I'm not sure that by the start of the next Rocket season that we'll have a start report card yet. And I think it's possible that if we head into the next season with perhaps maybe a CJ McCollum type as a placeholder or something like that for a year, that it will feel underwhelming and that it will feel stagnant a little bit, because I think it's really hard to get more out of this team with the current personnel than what Ime is currently getting out of them. And we'll get into that, the Rockets part of it, or as we go forwards with the pod. But for the Texans, I think you have pressure to make to get to the Super Bowl within CJ Stroud's first contract, right? But at the same time, and seeing how he did last season, he strikes me as the type of guy that like Mahomes can make a lot happen with subpar wide receivers. And now we know Nico Collins is a true 1A, but Tank Dell does not look as good as he looked last season. So I think we can say that CJ Stroud elevated him last season. I think he already had a number one in Nico Collins. That proved it has been proven that he didn't necessarily elevate as much as Nico's just that good. But thinking about Dalton Schultz and the way he's played this season versus the stats he was getting last season versus the stats he's getting this season, I think there's a lot of cases around the league of quarterbacks that get paid, and then that's just crippling to the team building around them. I think you can look at, the guys that got paid this offseason. I think Trevor Lawrence, the Jags just have no way. I just don't see any way that they become good in the near future with that contract. Tua, the same thing. Dak is eventually going, that when that hits for the Cowboys, the same thing. And when you look at the guys that got paid and it worked, it's guys that mostly their teams are elevated by them on offense. And you have two extreme examples of this. You have Mahomes and Josh Allen, that, with subpar receivers have made it work anyways. And you have the other side of the spectrum in Joe Burrow, who got paid. They still have the star receivers, but they had to cheap out or they had to cut on the defense, and they Joe Burrow gets the most insane stats every week, but it doesn't matter because defense can stop anybody. And so I think CJ was going to be capable of elevating, mediocre receivers. Perhaps you keep Nico Collins, and then the wide receivers 2 and 3 are either rookies or Robert Woods type of guys. And I think CJ will be able to elevate an offense like that as long as he has a really strong offensive line, which is what the Bills have, which is why it works so well for Josh Allen, and why he can be the superhero that he is as a quarterback and make everybody work. Okay, he had Khalil Shakir has been elevated, but I don't think anybody expected him to be this good. Mike Cooper, the same thing. All of the guys that he's feeding, Mark Collins and those types of guys, he's making it work anyways. And so I think I'm optimistic of a version of the Texans where you give CJ Stroud all the time in the pocket, but the receivers are not as good. And I trust that once he gets back into rhythm, that he'll be able to go back to what he was last season. And I think there's a bunch of reasons why CJ Stroud hasn't been able to be as good as he was. And I think it's also because the offense fails in so many different ways. Sometimes it doesn't have space to operate in the pocket. Sometimes it doesn't have time. Sometimes it's just an insanely quick failure of the pass protection. Sometimes it's the run game isn't working, and so it's telegraphed. Sometimes it's why the receivers getting injured, like Diggs and Nico at points in the season. Sometimes it's the wide receivers just like last game that are dropping balls. It's just I think it's so many different ways that the Texans have struggled offensively, so many different reasons that it's hard for him to adjust as a year two guy. And I think once you stabilize the offense, even if it's not as talented as it is this year, once that's stabilized, and at least if there's an issue, it's always the same issue instead of just fires popping up everywhere. I think or at least I'll be really, really optimistic about the Texans because I still have 100% faith in CJ Stroud. I asked on Twitter, it was a bit inflammatory, but I asked on Twitter a couple weeks back if CJ Stroud was still an above average quarterback for this season. And most of the replies, and I had like 50 replies, were saying, no, he isn't. And, I didn't give my opinion on it, but in my mind, I was like, I still think this guy is the guy. I just think there's a bunch of different reasons all at the same time that make it so he hasn't looked as good. And I think once, that stabilizes in the offseason, that we'll look back at it, maybe a reworked offensive line. And I think, if you get a good offensive line with CJ, with the defense they currently have, which I will say, I think they've gotten extremely lucky with injuries. At least, my stand that it was set last season with last season's Texans, and I saw so many injuries. So maybe this is more of the norm. But I think for the most part, the defenses has stayed together and haven't had that many, big injury problems. I mean, Kellen Petries obviously sucks, but there's other guys stepping up. Kellen Bullock stepping up. So all of this to say, I think even if they go into the next season with Nico Collins, CJ, a better offensive line, and this defense, I'll be confident that even if you lose pieces like, I don't know how NFL off seasons work, but I think if they have at least that, I'll be really confident. And by opposition with the Rockets, I think that's a real scenario where Booker and Phoenix doesn't break apart this offseason, or Fox and the Kings don't break apart this offseason, and you're stuck with a little bit of and one more transition year where you're, perhaps between 48 and 52 wins, which might be a little improvement on this, it might not, and you're waiting for that superstar to shake free, and you're stuck with a placeholder like a Colin Sexton or a CJ McCollum, or what Jimmy Butler would have been this season if they made the move for him. I think there's a real possibility that will be our reality, Rockets' reality, as we start next season. Even if it might be an in-season trade, Fox will be an expiring at that point. Maybe the Kings start off the season poorly. First 15 games, they're not in the playoffs, and Fox is like, okay, I want out. And at the same time, the Kings are like, they's not going to re-sign here, so might as well trade him and get something for him. Something like that may happen. And so because of that scenario, I'll edge towards the Texans just because, and I think the biggest message for me here, this is probably the most I've talked about the Texans ever, is I really believe in CJ. And I think as long as he's there and he has a stable offensive line that gives him time to work his magic, I think the Texans will be just fine, and they'll eventually shift into what the Bills have kind of become, which is, it's just a very solid team there every year, that their quarterback basically dictates how good or bad they're going to be, and that's compared to how good the league around them is. And I'll also say, long term, for the question I asked you, it's probably easier to see the Rockets getting bad just because of the Chiefs are not. There's no Chiefs in the NBA, and then as you said, I mean, I don't know how they have only one loss. I do keep up with them as well. I mean, I think it's luck, but at the same time, if it happens over and over and over again, you start to wonder like, is is this just
They're definitely good at closing out tight games, but just putting yourself in a tight game leaves you vulnerable. That's all I'm saying. Like, there's definitely some skill to them winning those types of games repeatedly. But the fact that you're not able to get separation, that's the kind of thing that in the playoffs can give a so-called lesser team a chance. And that's what I think that's all the Texans could really hope for if they're going on the road in the divisional round. They just want to be more competitive than they were at Baltimore a year ago and take your shot if you get to the fourth quarter and CJ has a chance. And I think, not saying for sure it's going to happen, but there is a world where the Texans, if they win the wild card game or the wild card round, would get to KC and be competitive and then take your shot. That's all you can really ask for in a season where so much has gone wrong.
who's gonna hold Chris Jones though? I'm scared for CJ Sell, dude. It's very tough.
But to your point on the Rockets and the status quo, we'll get into Fred VanVleet in a little bit, but I've been so surprised by people. There's been more macro talk the last few days because with the NBA Cup, there haven't been as many games. The schedule has been spaced out. And so people are thinking a little more bigger picture in terms of team building. And I've seen a lot of talk, oh, good thing the Rockets had the team option on Fred's deal. And people seem to have forgotten that because of the extensions prior to the year to Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green, the Rockets are not in a position to have much, if any, salary cap room. So the odds of them moving on from Fred altogether in a scenario where there's no big trade to be had. Now, sure, you could use Fred even as soon as this year's deadline, if not this year's deadline, that is next offseason as salary filler. That's conceivable. But if there's no major deal like that to bring in, if not the A1, something closer to the A1 than you have now, then I don't think the average Rockets fan has, come to grips with just how likely Fred is to return, because even with the shooting struggles, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but I think he's due for, at least somewhat of a progression to the mean, let's say, especially as the schedule eases up, which it's going to over the next 10 games or so. So the shooting should improve, but even with the shooting as bad as it is now, and I think at his low or close to career lows across the board, the advanced stats still really like him, and he's loved in the clubhouse. He does provide some value in terms of floor spacing, even if the shots aren't going in, because people around the NBA know Fred VanVleet can shoot the lights out. A lot of that comes down to usage, and we will get into that as we move our way through the pod. But to sort of circle back, there is a world where the Rockets stay the course with him. Now, if he underwhelms statistically this season, then the Rockets might could use that to their benefit in terms of, the next contract. Do they extend him at a lower average annual value, something along those lines? Or maybe they just pick up the option and use him as, salary filler. I don't know, because they're not in a position to have cap room anyway. But the point is, what you were saying about this scenario where Devin Booker or De'Aaron Fox, someone of that tier, doesn't shake free, and so you largely run it back next season and don't try to make a huge external move to put you in a new tier at the top of the Western Conference. Fred VanVleet could very well be a part of that scenario as well. And it feels like a lot of the discourse, seems to think that, if he doesn't get a lot better, then the Rockets are going to move on from Fred. And I don't think that's the thinking at all. We'll get into him more specifically in just a few minutes. But to close the loop on CJ and the Texans, certainly if they go on a strong postseason run and get to the AFC Championship game or beyond, the place this franchise has ever been, then I'll be buying in. But I could also see during the offseason, there's some copium to it, but there's also some truth in the reality that the more CJ gets away from the crazy stuff that's happened this season, the easier it's going to be for him to shed some of those bad habits. You're right. There has been some regression. He's not the guy that he was a year ago. And a lot of it comes down to not trusting the offensive line. And when that happens, it's not just, oh, the risk of injury. You see it framed that way on social media all the time. Oh, what happens if he gets hurt? No, it's not just about that. It's that his entire processing is sped up because he's not trusting that the line is going to hold up. He's not trusting his reads, what's in front of him. And before you know it, the chain starts to collapse because there's so many elements to it. And it's tough to fix that on the fly when there's games every week and you're not able to obviously do much with your personnel. Then it's very tough for him to magically become a different guy next Sunday or Saturday in this case than he was the previous weekend, as opposed to in the off season when, I mean, first things first, hopefully you can upgrade the personnel on the offensive line, as you said, but beyond that, just getting some time away from the game to watch the film and not go right back into the same habits, practice after practice, week after week. I think at that point, it'll be easier to make a clean break than it is on the fly. And so it's frustrating right now, but I could see by April, May, June of next year, me talking myself back into, the Texans figuring it out offensively, not just because of the personnel, but also any bad habits that CJ has acquired if things don't go well in the playoffs because the offense can't score at the level they need to. Then I think both personnel upgrades and just time and space from what's happened this year to sort of clear his head and start anew once training camp starts next July, I could see myself buying in come May or June, no matter what happens in the playoffs, unless it's just something crazy like, I don't know, they lose 45-3, just something totally demoralizing where he throws 4 or 5 touchdowns or 4 or 5 interceptions, and looks absolutely terrible. Anyway, enough Texans for one show. Just thought that'd be an interesting way to lead off. Rest of the pod, I promise, we'll talk Rockets specifically, both the micro of these two NBA Cup games, the quarterfinal against the Warriors, the win, and then the semifinal loss to the Thunder. There's obviously a lot of different places that we could start off that discussion. I think the obvious headline is that it's just really good to get that Golden State monkey off of this team's back. I think mentally that was hanging over them more than any of them would admit. So to put that 15-game streak in the rearview mirror, I think is huge. Obviously, they could draw the Warriors in the playoffs. It feels like for one reason or another, these franchises have been tied together for some time. So it would not surprise me if the Rockets see the Warriors down the road and they can draw upon this experience. But beyond that, I also think being able to get to the other side when things haven't been going your way, that's the kind of thing that can translate beyond just one team and one matchup. And so it's hard to say exactly how or when it got there, but even for this Ime Udoka-led group, I think the Warriors had become something of a bugaboo. And so I think being able to put that behind them, especially in the way that they did, a 7-0 run in the final minute 20 to get a win at home. And by the way, that Toyota Center crowd on the NBA Cup night was crazy good. We talked about NRG Stadium being great for the playoffs. I think that game should also show you what Toyota Center can be like once the games have more meaning, and hopefully we get to see that in the playoffs come April and May. Time will tell on that. But I just think the larger takeaway is that not only do you shake away all the bad feelings, the bad vibes from, Rockets Warriors the last 2 years, not going to count the tanking era before that, but I also think that this team sort of proves something to itself, that even when things are hard, they are capable of getting to the other side. And so I think that's a good place to start, even in a week that ended with a little bit of disappointment, the 15-point loss to the Thunder in Las Vegas. Good to get the experience and, to get on that stage. They had a lot of great press. They got to, see how they perform under the lights. Even if it's bad, there's still value in the experience. There's 26 other teams that didn't get there at all to the Final Four in Las Vegas, so you'll take it. All in all, I think the good outweighs the bad, especially when you factor in the baggage and the history of that Rockets-Warriors matchup. And so for me, I look at this a little more broadly because I think, and some of the bright lights, the NBA Cup, the national television dynamic, the Warriors game was on TNT to a nationwide audience. The Thunder game was Houston's first on ABC in 5 seasons. And so The Rockets, especially offensively, did not look great in either of those games, especially the second one. They didn't get to 100 in either. And so I think that's created a little bit of a disconnect right now between the perception of this team, the discourse, and what the reality is. I want this to be something of a pick-me-up for the audience, because even if people think they're above, listening to someone like Kendrick Perkins at ESPN, he predicted the Rockets would get blown out by the Thunder. We heard Charles Barkley saying after the Golden State win that the Rockets have no idea how to play basketball. Even if you're a fan and you look at those guys and say, well, they're casuals, at the same time, when guys with those types of megaphones are using them in a not ideal way to talk about your team, even subconsciously, it can drive the discourse, especially in a period where there aren't a lot of games because of this break in the schedule. And so because of that, I think the perception of the Rockets right now is a little bit worse than the reality. And so the perception, what everybody's honed in on, they're fatally flawed offensively. There's some truth in that for sure, at least in terms of being a title contender this year. But as we said leading off with the whole Rockets-Texans discussion, nobody was expecting the Rockets to be a title contender this year. Prior to the season, Rockets were not on anybody's radar. The over-under was either 42.5 or 43.5 games. They were just 41-41 last year, number 11 seed in a loaded Western Conference, barely on national TV at all. People knew they were better than the Steven Silas tanking years, but the Rockets were not on the radar, certainly nationally, and to a lot of local fans in Houston, they were far below the Astros and the Texans in the pecking order. It's only been the last few weeks that the Rockets have really captured attention, both locally and nationally. I would actually put the inflection point as the week of Thanksgiving, because they had the big win at Minnesota when they clinched their cup group and got to the knockout stages. They won 10 of 12 overall, dating back to the middle of that month. And then on Sunday the 1st, that was the Sunday right after Thanksgiving, that was the win they had over the Thunder, the game where Fred VanVleet actually went off with a season-high 38. Obviously, that shows you, as we said at the time, what the Rockets are capable of when they have that version of Fred or a guard producing at that level. And that actually brought the Rockets to within a half game of the Thunder in the standings. And then at that point, the Rockets had basically forced their way into the local and then even the national discourse. People were paying way more attention because, based on the record, how can you not, especially you're more than a quarter of your way into the season. And so people are talking about them. They're getting more national TV games because they're getting to the Final 8 and then the Final 4 of the NBA Cup. And everything's been under the microscope since. But there's just a lot in that process that's getting either forgotten or just getting swept up in narratives and generalizations. The first point I would raise, you've got to adjust your expectations to the schedule. If you look at December, the Rockets are just 3-3 right now, but there's some important qualifiers that we need to add. Of the 6 games this month, 4 have come against the Thunder and the Warriors. Those are 2 elite defensive teams. In the case of the Thunder, the best defense in the whole NBA and maybe the best team in the league overall. In the case of the Warriors, that's a notoriously difficult matchup. We've talked about that ad nauseum, especially the last few weeks. And then the other 2 games were West Coast against the Clippers and the Kings. On the road, both teams right now at 500 or better. And in the case of the Clippers, they're a top 5 defense as well. And then you got to consider, the home and road splits. As is the case with most young teams, Rockets are way better at home. They're 10-3 at Toyota Center. They're 7-6 in road or neutral games. Of the 6 games this month, 4 have been outside of Houston, and the only 2 in Houston have been against elite defenses in the Thunder and the Warriors. And I also think those NBA Cup games, they're even more defensive-minded because with it being a playoff-like atmosphere, they tend to officiate the games a little more loosely, allow more contact. And so, bottom line, it becomes a little more difficult to score, especially if you don't have that perimeter alpha, which we know is a deficiency for the current Rockets. So as I see it, just from the start, when you look at who they were playing this month, or at least the first half of this month, the narrative was just set up for them to fail. that line that Barkley had about the Rockets not knowing how to play basketball, if you were going to use this stretch as a referendum, it was always going to end up looking like that at some point. This team just does not have the personnel yet, especially with a struggling Fred VanVleet. So against good teams, it's going to look clunky, and especially in the really high leverage moments. You've got to zoom out a little to get a better picture of what's actually going on, because I think there's a lot of missing the forest for the trees here. A couple more things I want to note before I hand things off to you, Paolo. So not only did the Rockets beat the Warriors, but they closed out the game on a 7-0 run in the final minute, 20 seconds. There was a great stat from John Schumann of NBA.com, their power rankings guy, that I'm going to quote here. Houston has won 4 of its last 5 games that were within 5 points in the final 5 minutes, having allowed just 47 points on 52 clutch possessions. If you just listen to the narratives, you'd think the Rockets were cooked in these late game scenarios because the lack of offense, the lack of shooting, you hear Ime Udoka getting criticized for not being creative enough. I personally think a lot of that's superficial because the bottom line is whether the ball goes in the basket or not, how easily it does or doesn't. That's just the first thing that always jumps off the page when you're watching a basketball game. It's just human nature. The reality is that the defense matters just as much, and the Rockets are locking up teams when it really matters. And then in terms of the creativity, I mean, Ime has actually been, we can talk about tactical creativity. I guess that's a fair criticism at this point because they haven't made a ton of adjustments. But at least in terms of lineup creativity, I think he's done really well. We saw late in that Warriors game, there was this conundrum that you need Alperen Sengun to get buckets in the half court offensively. But then in the second half, when the Warriors were just setting these screens really high up the court, and they were just torching them on defense. Well, late in the game, they basically flipped in these late game possessions, bringing in Amen Thompson and Tari Eason for defense, and then Alperen Sengun and Green for offense, and largely they got the best of both worlds. And then the way that game ended, I mean, for me, it was just a perfect microcosm of this team. Steve Kerr can bitch about the foul call all he wants. Draymond can cry about it being the most painful loss since the 2016 finals. By the way, that should tell you just how dialed in the Warriors were. But to get back to the point, which is the call, the NBA confirmed multiple times there was a foul. And what happened, Jalen Green just outworked Jonathan Kuminga and beat him to the spot for that rebound. And the Rockets run the double bonus because a possession earlier, Sengun had drawn a foul against Draymond, and then he scored on Kevon Looney a few seconds after that. And so for the Rockets, a team that prides itself on defense, effort, rebounding, being the try-hard, scrappier team, getting to the line through physicality, attacking the paint because they don't have the ability to beat you through skill, you couldn't script a more fitting way for them to win a game like that against a good opponent. And again, this all comes at a time in which a lot of these narratives would have you believe that this team has no idea what it's doing when a game gets to winning time. But if you look beyond the narratives and look how these games are actually playing out, the reality is pretty different. 4-1 in their last 5 games that have been within 5 points in the last 5 minutes. And in terms of how everything translates to the playoffs, so when they get there, I looked it up. The Rockets are actually 9-5 this year against teams with winning records. The only teams in the entire NBA with better records against winning teams, Cleveland, Boston, and OKC. And so the reason I bring all that up, it feels like there's this growing narrative that the Rockets are just regular season merchants and they'll get exposed in higher leverage games, yada, yada. That's not what's really happening. They're actually playing fairly well in the clutch. They're performing well against good teams. The formula is holding up. They're just not yet to the level of the true top-tier teams, the Cavs, the Celtics, the Thunder. And that's totally okay when you look at the bigger picture and you consider what the true baseline is, or at least was, entering this season. And then even if you want to look at December, I'll bring this thing full circle since I led off this mini rant talking about the schedule. You've got to allow at least some time for the schedule to even out. Because just as the first 6 games have been difficult, well, now you've got the next 4 between the 19th and the 26th of December. You've got 2 against the Pelicans starting Thursday at home. And then you've got road games in Charlotte and Toronto. All of those 4 games are against teams that are more than 10 games below 500. And most of them are just ravaged by injuries. So even if you look at the recent record and say, well, you are what your record says you are, they're 500 this month. Well, for the season, the Rockets are still 17-9, number 3 in the Western Conference. By the way, Memphis is a half game ahead of them at 18-9, but they've been really lucky. They've actually had the third easiest schedule in the NBA to date, and they have the most difficult schedule in the NBA the rest of the way. By comparison, the Rockets have had the fourth most difficult schedule in the NBA to date, and they are right in the middle of the pack, 13th in terms of remaining strength of schedule. So the underlying metrics show that if, knock on wood, the Rockets can stay healthy, I think Memphis is at 2 right now by a half game. I think there's easily a world where the Rockets can pass them, and we already know they beat them by 20 points head-to-head as well. No, there's limited value in what you can take from any, late October game, but it is there. The point is, 17-9, number 3 in the West, that's a lot better than what the current narrative would lead you to believe if you just checked in on Rockets Twitter at any point the last few days. So on that note, I'll hand things off to you, Paolo. I'm, certainly not saying there aren't concerns. There are. I'm just saying that they've already got a championship level defense, number 2 in the NBA. They're number 18 on offense. I get the frustration, but when you dig deeper and you think about what the expectations were, when you look at the schedule, who they've played in this recent sort of mediocre stretch, it just feels like that the cart is ahead of the horse in some of the, I don't want to say panic, but I'll say pessimism. So let's start there. Before we get into the micro of any individual games or players, we'll certainly touch on Fred as promised, or any changes maybe they make this week because they've got these extra off days and practices that they don't normally have over the grind of an 82-game regular season. What are your broader thoughts as far as the discourse right now and what we've learned about this team over this relatively difficult NBA Cup stretch of play?
Yeah, I think just to talk about the games in specific first. The Rockets Warriors game was just an absolute thriller. I stayed up until I think it was 5:30 a.m. I had to get up at 8. And it was all worth it. And about the call, it feels all the sweeter that Steve Kerr had to pitch about the call. We Rockets fans have been on the short end of the stick against the Warriors as far as officiating goes in much bigger stakes games, as everybody knows. It felt extra good that it was that way. And I will say, he has no reason to complain because to me, and I said this on Twitter, the ref was to me there was, I think the ref was being reasonable in the sense that, yes, I do get that they don't call that foul on these types of close situations. They probably call it jump ball 9 out of 10 times, but it is a foul, so you can complain on that. And besides that, to me it was clear. Chingun got fouled on the offensive board. The exact same ref that had the perfect view of that offensive foul is the exact same ref that then called the foul on Jalen. And to me, trying to think of what the ref was saying, and to me, it's pretty clear. He was like, okay, I don't want to end this game on a foul call on an offensive rebound, but it's clearly a foul. And so I'll just let it go. The Rockets likely get this offensive rebound. This is in the moment of the foul, right? Of the foul that was not called. The Broncos are probably going to get the rebound here, and they have a timeout. They'll have 10 seconds to go win the game. And to me, me thinking I'm the ref, to me, that's a fair way to win this game, right? They get a shot, right? They don't end the game on free throws, but they get a shot to win the game with 10 seconds left. It's fair enough. If they can do it, they can do it. That's the most reasonable way to win the game. Considering that it's not purely a rule book, usually the refs at the end of the games, they let them play. To me, that seems like a happy medium, right? But at the point, but after that, the Rockets don't get the offensive rebound. And now, if you're the ref, you're stuck between two situations. Well, I didn't call this foul, but this team does not deserve to lose like this, right? So I didn't call the offensive foul on the rebound. I'll call the offensive foul. This is a foul, so I'll be strict on this one because the Warriors never should have been in a situation to try to force a jump ball in the first place because they fouled on the offensive rebound. Shingun half position got pushed by Looney. It's as clear cut of an offensive foul call as clear cut of an offensive rebounding foul call as there is. So to me, it was you got the fair result in the end. So doesn't matter. But I will say it did feel incredibly good to get that monkey off our backs. and it was some of the best 2.5 hours of sleep that I got afterwards. But then to move on to the Thunder game, listen, we kept it close for 3 quarters basically, well maybe 2.5 quarters, and at some point the difference in talent showed, and the team that had Shea won the game because well they had Shea. And he had he was getting defended well, but he still had a good game. Still got a lot of foul calls. Still had 5 steals on the block. They still have the first and the second best advantage creators on the floor that night in Shea and Jalen Williams. And Isaiah Hartenstein was, being a menace as he is with those floater little shots that are just kind of triggered shit out of me because he shouldn't have that kind of touch as a running big web or whatever. And so my main takeaway from that game is, well, against a really good team trying their hardest, the ball that we've been calling out for weeks now ended up shining through. And, that's just, such is life. There were still some positive takeaways from that game for me. From the combination of the two games, I thought Amen Thompson, with when the lights were brightest, was one of the players that shone through. He played better than his usual self. He made some good shots, and against the Thunder, specifically against the Warriors, mostly played really good defense and forced turnovers. And he wasn't inefficient, but didn't go off for 19 points, which for him is going off. And I thought I was impressed with Jabari's shot making ability, and on a team where shot making is very scarce. Sorry, it was a little bit of it was refreshing to be confident that when Jabari was pulling up for a mid-range shot, I thought, hey, this is lucky going in. Or it's either that or he's throwing free throws. And so, a team that struggles this much offensively, I think there should be space that if Jabari is rolling, not necessarily giving him the ball in the post and letting him go to work, because that's not his game, but calling plays where he's, curling around the screen and either getting a three or stepping into a mid-range shot closer to the basket. I think that those are, that's something that they can incorporate more in the offense as a designed play. And again, not necessarily feeding the post. We already do that way too much. I love all people. We don't have the spacing to be constantly feeding the post. And so those were my two biggest takeaways as far as those couple of games were. I thought Jabari and the men were pretty big standouts as positives. And then as far as the general outlook of the team, listen, I think we've always got to keep in mind what the expectations are at the beginning of the season. Because, like it or not, the NBA is an 82 game sample. And
Right. I guess that's what I'm getting at. It felt like to me that the lens just totally flipped. Like when the Rockets were 15-6 and nobody had paid much attention to them at all, but all of a sudden you get into December and you're a half game back of the Thunder for the 1 seed, and you've already clinched your cup group and you're getting these national TV games. It feels like all of a sudden people started looking at the Rockets through the lens of a contender. And through that lens, yeah, you'll nitpick every flaw. In reality, if you've been following this team throughout, you should have that type of perspective that you're talking about.
yeah, and which is why I don't think that while we are trying to win now, I don't think we're going all the way trying to win now in every single margin that we could possibly get. I'd say that last season we were probably maybe a 60-40, 60 trying to win, 40, doing so or only winning through guys that we want to build for the future. And I think this season it's more of a maybe an 80-20 or an 85-15. If this team wanted to play to win more, and we'll get into how they could do that, as we go along the pod, they've played Amen Thompson more. They've played Tyrese and more. They've made changes to the starting lineup. Perhaps Aaron Holiday will play more as he is doing. Perhaps they would have given other guys chances to get more minutes in nights where Jalen doesn't have it going. We haven't seen Jalen be benched when he's having a bad game as much as we did last season. We've seen he may make guys play through mistakes a bit as well. So I think all in all, you've got to remain conscious of what the expectations were when the season started, and you have to and it's perfectly fine for you to adjust them as the season goes along, but you can't switch from 8 to 80 on a based off of 20 games. To me, the way I view this team is my expectation now is that they get to 50 wins. and they're on pace to do so. And they were at some point on pace for nearly 55, if I'm not mistaken. But I always expected some sort of regression to eventually come in. And I don't even think that this team regressed. I think they faced good teams, and, against good teams, they managed to, against the Kings, perhaps you expect to beat them, but they are a competent team, and so they are going to. You're going to lose some of those games. You're not going to beat every single team that you're a favorite against, and you're not going to get beaten by every single team that you're an underdog against. They beat the Thunder. It's just like they beat the Thunder. It's expected that they'll lose some games to the Kings. The Warriors were obviously, a team that, even though they're not underdogs on, the betting apps, they are underdogs, mentally. And when you look at those games, it always seemed like an extra challenge to beat them. They probably were underdogs against the Timberwolves. They beat them. Just looking back at the schedule, probably shouldn't be underdogs against a lot of these teams. But all in all, I think they're performing above expectations for what the season was. And a 500 stretch of 4 games, or 6 games,
Yeah.
is not the end of the world, and it's not really even that much below what's expected. The Rockets right now are, if they play 500 basketball until the end of the season, they'd finish 4 wins against above 500.
They finished 45 and 37. Yeah.
Right, which would be a 4-win improvement on last season.
Yeah.
They would break their over-under, and if you asked most people at the start of the season, they would probably take that result, as it likely entails a playoff spot. And this is assuming that what people are calling a slump, which is 500, that slump extends through the entire season. I think a lot of people expect us to be better than that. And so they are still very much on track to have a near 50-win season, or to have a 50-win season. But even if the norm is closer to what it has been the last 6 games, still close to 500. And so, just before we get into the Fred VanVleet stuff, I think that's mostly my assessment on what currently is going on. And always don't lose sight of the fact that we are, yes, trying to win now. We aren't going all out trying to win now. Right now, we're also, developing guys as we go along, and
They're not trading for Zach LaVine. Yeah.
yeah, and we'll get into the upsides and downsides of maybe giving a man more responsibility and stuff like that. Just remember that giving guys more responsibility before they're ready for it backfires a lot of the time. And so, yes, they could start a man, Tari, Dylan Brooks, Jabari, and Sengun, and maybe they'd win more like that. But at the same time, if it goes wrong, you're kind of burning a man on reps that he's not ready for. You're burning Tari on reps that he's not ready for you, and it's not linear. And at the same time, playing through mistakes is good when there's no expectations. When there's expectations and you're playing through mistakes, it can cause you to have tendencies that are not healthy long term for development of young players. You can reach situations like, what an extreme of something like that would be Ben Simmons. He had a flaw to his game. He was forced to play through it. It reached a point where it became a mental block, and he was never the same player. Obviously, there were injuries, but he was never the player that he was supposed to be. If you forced him and Thompson to shoot 5 threes a game from now on, if you forced him to initiate the entire offense, on the same usage rate that Fred VanVleet has, he'd struggle because his handle is not ready. He can kind of shoot catch and shoot shots, can't pull up. These mid-range shots that he's slowly trying starting to take again, that he used to take in with the overtime elite in the overtime elite league, those are slowly creeping back, right? If he had to take 7 or 8 of those a game, it's likely that his efficiency will take a dip. And now you're overloading him with bad shots, which is gonna affect his mental in general for the game. Oh, I didn't have a good game because I was 7 for 20, and mostly because of the type of shot that I took. And it will hurt specific parts of his game as well. His overall morale as a player in general. And I think every little change, and we're going to get into potential changes, has a cascading effect across the entire team. So you can't really just think of this as a win now or at all costs type of team, because that has costs long term. And while if you have a 33 or 34-year-old cast with an aging superstar, you're okay kind of burning those cartridges because it's all about getting the best that you can right now, like the James Harden era. While building, if you're trying to build something sustainable, you don't make you don't make every decision from the point of view of being short-sighted and winning or getting the most juice out of the team right now.
To your point on the win pace, it's actually a decent bit better than 50. So 17-9, if you extrapolate that over 82 games, it's 53.6. So if you round up, that's 54 wins. And there's also the matter that the Rockets have faced the fourth most difficult schedule in the NBA to date. They're only 13 the rest of the way, so the schedule is going to get easier. So if you round, you're at a 54 win pace now, and the schedule is going to be easier over the final 2/3 of the season than it's been over the first third, at least in the aggregate. So not saying I expect the Rockets to win in the mid-50s, and they're probably going to have injuries at some point. They have been fairly fortunate on that front to this point, although maybe with them being a deeper team, not relying on any one guy too heavily, also having more depth to plug and play when things do inevitably happen, maybe they're more immune to the injury concerns than a lot of teams are over 82 games. We'll have to see what happens on that front. Anyway, as far as to close out the pod, spinning it more forward-looking, because most of our discussion has been looking back, not just at the micro of the games against the Warriors and the Thunder, but also the macro of where they are in the rebuild, what we've learned to this point in the season, why I think Paolo and myself are largely aligned with the current discourse and the level of pessimism not really being appropriate for what we've seen on the balance from this team, and especially when you start to add the important layers of context, such as the schedule and how that's going to even out a little bit as December winds down. Now, if they go 2-2 or worse, and this next week, we may have a very different discussion on next week's pod. But for now, I think a lot of the pessimistic takes are unfair and largely based on narratives that were put in place by people that haven't really watched this team and don't understand the context the way most of us should after, certainly our podcast listeners, the diehards that listen to me and Paolo ramble for an hour plus every week. You should have a pretty good handle on what reasonable expectations were going into this year and why the Rockets, even with a somewhat underwhelming December to date, are still far out kicking their coverage, to go back to one more football analogy. Anyway, looking forward, there's one change, and this is a week. In some ways, it reminds me of an All-Star break. And we saw last year how they did tweak the offense over the All-Star break. They came out playing a lot faster with more pace, shooting more threes. It seemed to work to the benefit of Jalen Green. I'm not going to predict that. I think at this point, Jalen is who he is until proven otherwise. I think that inconsistency is baked in. And while I would love to see him improve, I would love to feel better about Jalen in a few months than we do right now. I'm not counting on it. The Rockets are panicking. They're not going to remove him from the starting lineup anytime soon, I don't think. But the peaks and valleys, that is simply the Jalen Green experience through 4 years in the NBA. It is what it is. And we've talked about it a lot, both the benefits and the drawbacks in terms of how it fits into your formula as a team. I don't want to go down that road again, and I don't think the Rockets are looking at any major changes, and I don't think any of them are going to dramatically benefit Jalen. However, there are some tweaks they could make, and this being a week that's similar to an All-Star break, you only have one game between last Saturday in Vegas and next Sunday in Toronto. So you have one game in a span of over a week, and it's at home against a bad New Orleans team that is ravaged by injuries. So it's not just the time off. It's also being in Houston for a very long stretch like that and actually getting to have legit practices, which are fairly rare during the season, day after day. Similar to the All-Star break, this is a time where if you wanted to make some more fundamental changes to your style of play, to your rotation, you conceivably could, because you're not just doing it on the fly. You'd be putting them in a better position to succeed by actually having people prepared. And so when I think of how they can potentially change things up, if they want to try and, kickstart the offense, I think there's one change I expect, and there's one that I'm curious about. The one that I expect, and this is lower leverage, but I think the minutes that went to Aaron Holiday against the Warriors and the Thunder will go to Reed Shepherd or Cam Whitmore. Not because Aaron Holiday deserves to lose the minutes, but it's what you were saying, Paolo, in terms of the Rockets thinking not just about the here and now, maximizing odds in a given game, but also the bigger picture and upside. And I think the likeliest scenario is they just go back to Reed and trust that over a larger sample, he's going to make the shots that coming out of Kentucky, we all expected him to make when he's billed as one of the best shooting prospects of this generation. And so it's not so much that the Rockets are super down on Reed. It's just when the stakes got really high in these winner-take-all knockout run games in the NBA Cup against elite opponents, I think they said, you know what? We're going to go with the steady hand of Aaron Holiday. When the schedule eases up and you can think a little bit bigger picture, I think they'll go for the development and the upside of a guy like Reed Shepherd. But there's also a world where if they want Reed to get some reps in the G League, and the Vipers do have a decent amount of games coming up, I believe, starting Thursday, you could send Reed to the G League and bring Cam Whitmore back up. Because it's not like you necessarily need a point guard. For the most part, you're staggering Fred VanVleet and Jalen Green, and those are your lead guards. So Aaron Holiday, even though he's a point guard in size, he's not really being used as a point guard. He's primarily a floor spacer, and it helps to have a secondary ball handler. But even in his minutes, it's still Fred or Jalen that's running the show, usually Jalen, because it's tough to play two guys of that limited size. So while I think going back to the rotation pre-Golden State and Reed being in place of Aaron, and you always have the insurance policy if Reed doesn't have it going in the first half and the game is high stakes in the second half and competitive, maybe you go Aaron then. He seems to, not need a lot of time to get hot. And so that's one of the benefits of having Aaron near the end of your bench. It's a very useful insurance policy. But I think at least in the first half, the likely scenario is that you go back to Reed, and there's at least some world where maybe you don't play a point guard at all in those minutes. You run Fred and Jalen as your ones and bring back Cam Whitmore. But I just think the minutes that were earmarked for Aaron Holiday, not a ton, but 10 to 15 minutes a game, will go to either Cam or Reed. That's my prediction, especially at a point of the schedule where it's going to be a little bit easier, at least on paper. And hopefully the Rockets, if they're able to get leads early in these games, have a bigger margin. And so because of that, it's easier for the young guys to, you can see at times Reed, I think, gets indecisive, not just because he's not shooting the ball well, but also if the game is competitive, he's thinking, hey, do I want to waste a possession, especially when I'm not fully confident? As opposed to if you're playing with a 10, 15, 20-point lead, it gets a lot easier for these young guys to, feel emboldened to play in the way that the Rockets hope they will when they're at their best. And this is the type of week where against lesser opponents, I know you can point out that the Hornets beat the Rockets back in October, but that's pretty clearly a fluke by this point. And also probably the MVP for the Hornets in that game was Grant Williams, who locked up Alperen Sengun in the second half, took him out of the game in the half court. And now Grant Williams is lost for the year. So that dynamic isn't going to be there. So should be a friendlier week. And so I think you'll see at least one of Reed or Cam, probably Reed, but Cam wouldn't floor me in the rotation on Thursday night against the Pelicans. The other change, the Fred VanVleet problem, and we've hinted at it a few times throughout the pod. I thought that game Saturday, and it was sort of fitting that Fred was the guy who really struggled, 1 of 11 from 3. The one make came when the game was already over. And so when the Rockets beat Oklahoma City a couple of weeks before, we know he had 38 points, good efficiency, hit the big threes down the stretch. We said the Rockets get that version of Fred, or Jalen for that matter. That's what can take this team from good to great. Well, the Rockets did not have that version in the rematch against the Thunder from Las Vegas, and this was the result. And I thought the stretch in the third quarter, or the fourth quarter, where the game really got away from them, Fred had a wide open 3 with about 7 minutes left that would have cut the lead to 2. He missed it. And then I believe on the other end, the Rockets fouled on a 3. The Thunder went up 8. And within a minute or so after that, the Thunder were up double digits, and you could tell the opportunity was lost and that the window had shut. And I don't even really criticize. I saw some saying, oh, the defenders need to be, less aggressive on the threes. Well, the Rockets are an aggressive defense to begin with. It's sort of their calling card. But also, when you aren't making shots, you're inherently going to be a little more aggressive defensively because you think you have to be Superman, hopefully getting some blocks and transition runouts because you just can't trust your half-court offense when you're shooting that poorly. And so I thought it was only fitting that Fred was the guy involved in that sequence where it got away from them. And, as far as Fred being a problem, I mentioned earlier the advanced stats paint a much rosier picture than the surface level stats. So I don't think it's quite as bad as, you look at him shooting below 38% overall, just better than 30% on threes, basically his worst as a consistent rotation player in the NBA. The advanced stats show that he's still having a clear impact on a team level. And so I don't think the Rockets are going to panic. As I mentioned leading off the pod, I think the discussions about moving on from him altogether are just way, way premature at this point. But we're also at a point in the schedule where a third of the way into the season, we can't just dismiss it as nothing either. This is inefficient shooting from a guy who last year shot nearly 39% on threes. This is not the same version of Fred VanVleet. And so is there a way that you can better optimize your offense and, for that matter, better optimize Fred? And so I'm sort of torn on what they should do and what they will do. And it's probably not going to be at either extreme. It could be, you tilt a little bit in one direction or the other. But there is a case to largely stay the course. Like, if you keep using Fred the way you've used him the last 2 years, and maybe now he's 30, so perhaps the shooting percentage is a little bit worse because he's not getting the separation he used to, I could buy that. But he's still good for Alperen Sengun, I think. He's definitely good for your defense because he limits turnovers. We've seen stretches without Fred this year where the turnovers are just gotten absolutely out of control. And if you turn over the ball, then that could harm your biggest strength on defense. The other thing we've got to consider as part of this debate, it's not like any of the alternatives are going to be better, even if we dial down Fred's playmaking, because I don't think you're going to really dial down his minutes. It's about how he's used. I don't think, no one should think that Fred VanVleet has forgotten how to shoot a basketball. I can promise you that has not left him. It's the types of shots that he's getting. And so when we look at him as a shooter, when we look at his value as a leader, he still provides a solid, respectable level of defense. The advanced stats still show him as one of the 2 or 3 best players on the roster. There's not nothing to all of that. There is still value. And so off the top, I want to say these extreme takes of, bench him. No, that's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen. But we can have reasonable discussions about scaling down his role in terms of usage or changing. And I guess this goes hand in hand, scaling down and changing how he's used. And perhaps if you use him off ball more, he's going to make more shots. And so that gives you more shooting gravity. That's the case for it. And so where I get sort of stuck in this, it's easy to say, well, the status quo isn't really working on the offensive end of the court. And Fred's 30. He's not going to get any better, especially as an undersized point guard. And your other options, you could go back to the offense you had. It's interesting when you think of how we got here. The first 5 games of the year, I know it feels like a long time ago, but when they had that 3-2 start, it felt like late last season in which most offense ran through Jalen Green. Then the 6th game was that crazy game against Golden State where they fell behind by 30, and then everything was a Minatari scramble ball in the second half. And then the next week, the games against the Knicks and the Spurs, typically the Knicks game, there was a talking point going into that of Sengun really struggling. Well, they made a clear, concerted effort to get Sengun the ball in that Knicks game. He went off. It was a feel-good win. Then the schedule eased up. They started stacking wins, and it felt like they just sort of retreated back into what they were for most of last year, the version of themselves before Alperen Sengun went out with the injury in mid-March, and largely before Jalen Green went on his crazy run to end last season. And so it feels like around that 3rd or 2nd week of the season, whenever it was, really the Knicks game is where it feels like it turned to me. The Rockets largely went back to how they ran their offense and sort of what the hierarchy was for most of last season, with Fred and Sengun being, centerpieces, and especially in a stretch where Jalen wasn't shooting it well anyway, although I will concede you could also make a case that maybe Jalen didn't play as well because he's not getting the same touches to get in rhythm. There's plenty of compelling arguments you can make on multiple sides of this whole equation. But now that we're 26 games in, and the numbers for Fred from an efficiency standpoint are just not there, and at his age, he's going to bounce back some, but I don't know. He's not going to magically become a different player at this point in his career. There's an argument you can also make that if Fred is not what he was a year ago, even if he bounces back some, we're deep enough into the season where I don't think he's going to get back to where he was a year ago, just from a math perspective. Should the Rockets be giving some of those playmaking lead guard reps to younger guys with more upside? Obviously, Jalen Green would be the first candidate. If not Jalen, maybe it's Amen Thompson. We've seen him do a little bit more in terms of playmaking when he gets to start in the games that Fred hasn't been out there. You could make a case to some very small extent for Tari Eason, maybe Cam Whitmore or Reed Shepherd if they ever get going, but they're a ways away. I think the more realistic alternatives in the very short term are clearly Jalen Green and Amen Thompson. And so from an upside perspective, I get why. And it may not be as simple as passing the torch. It could be running a little bit more through Jalen and Amen, a little bit less through Fred. It may not be a full-blown line change, if you will. But I also see the case, especially with the Rockets needing to win games against weaker opponents. These would be bad ones to lose against teams like the Raptors, the Hornets, the Pelicans, with going the higher floor route. I guess that's what I would say with Fred. The floor is pretty high. This formula they've got right now, even with Fred not shooting that well, as you mentioned, Paolo, they're still on pace to win 54 games. And the number 3 in the Western Conference, a half game back of number 2. And Fred, even when he's not scoring, his ability to take care of the ball, avoid turnovers, that helps you defensively a lot. That's a big-time point of emphasis for Ime Udoka. And so there is a compelling case to say, you know what? Stay the course. You're good enough as is, and make this a meritocracy. That's a term you've used in the past, Paolo. This idea that you don't make any radical changes just based on what you think should be true or could be true, that you make those younger guys earn higher minutes or higher usage in the case of Jalen Green and Amen Thompson. So you keep the door open if they play well enough, but if they don't, and Jalen in particular has not been much better than Fred, if at all, from an efficiency perspective, then you just stay the course because the status quo has a high floor way higher than any of us thought going into the year. And even if they go out in the first or second round of the playoffs, whatever, it's still a really good year. There's a case for that. But there's also a case for, look, if this team has a high enough floor anyway because of the defense, and they're going to be in the playoffs no matter what, why don't you experiment more with running more offense through Jalen Green, Amen Thompson? Maybe even you get Jabari Smith Jr., some mid-post touches a little bit. Dial down the pick and roll, especially because it's not like Şengün is shooting the ball nearly as well this year either. So I don't think Fred in the pick and roll is not as beneficial for Şengün, at least from a scoring perspective, as he was a year ago. And maybe you can use the floor argument both ways in that, yes, there's a case to stay the course based on the floor being so high as is. But there's also a case where if the floor is high enough, then maybe that allows you to think more upside in terms of how you sort of divvy up those playmaking reps and go for someone that's younger and has another gear that they can conceivably reach. Whether they will or not is an open question, but conceivably it's certainly there. I'm just sort of torn. I don't expect any radical changes, but it wouldn't shock me if, especially with this time, just sort of think bigger picture, go back to the drawing board, and against weaker opponents where we know Jalen in particular has tended to fare a lot better, it wouldn't floor me if this offense looks a lot different the next 4 games, not just in terms of the scoring output, but how they score and who is doing the initiating. Paolo, how would you balance those factors as we wind down the pod and we try and project what they should do and what they will do as the schedule eases up?
So I'll start it off by saying I'm incredibly frustrated. And if you look at when I do get to watch the games, because they are insanely late, when you look at my live commentary, I do lose my patience a lot with Fred VanVleet and with Jalen as well. And, to his discredit in this case, I think Alperen Şengün is not having a season that's defensively, he's having a season that's been better than expectations. I don't think he's lived up to expectations offensively, not even close. And I think he's probably not as big of a problem, but a pretty massive problem as well. Because, he's improved defensively, but we do need his offense. He's not the biggest problem, but he's the third biggest problem pretty easily.
And that's why I'm sort of torn on this idea that it's Fred's fault that he's shooting worse. I mean, there's probably some elements of that, but some of it is also that Şengün's just missing shots that he needs to make and that he's made in the past. So that's another part of it.
And
You can make an argument that Fred's holding him back, but some of it's just Şengün needs to be better, period.
No, if anything, the whole team with the lack of spacing is holding him back, but that was partly the case last season as well. It's a combination of him missing shots that he usually makes, and there's been a little bit of a shot selection difference. He's shooting more mid-range shots, and he's not making them at a good enough pace to justify it and to make it so he's settling for them more. And I've been a big advocate for him taking more of those shots because, if he becomes good enough, those are good shots to take, but I don't think he's been good enough at those either. And he's shooting them off balance sometimes. He typically used to take them mostly facing up. He's taking them falling, fading away. Those are not nearly as good. Either way, that's not the big issue here. The big issue is Fred and Jalen have both been terrible. And and as I was saying, if you watch my last commentary of the games, I ask for Fred to be subbed out constantly. I don't really ask for Jalen to be subbed out because he just gets subbed out either way. That's what happens live in game. Because the Rockets are good, because the expectation for every game is that they're going to win, and they're in every game, fighting. In real time, I overreact because, if the expectation is to win, I'm going to treat it like it's a do it or die game every single time. But when I step back after the games, after not the day of, but days after, and I look back, I remember what we were talking about earlier in the pod. That it's not really just the do or die every single game. And because of that, I think that they can tweak stuff, but they shouldn't go overboard with it as far as changing too much of the way it is. Because truth is, as it is, the Rockets are on pace for an over 50 win season, and so up until the point where it starts breaking too much, you don't change it. And looking at this stretch of games, the stretch of games in which they went 500, Thunder, Kings, Warriors, Clippers, Thunder, you expect to lose to the Thunder both times, and losing one game out of four when two of them are the Warriors, one of them is the Clippers, one of them is the Kings, is not really far from from what the expectation is when you look at that stretch. It's not. It's nothing. It's nothing that would make you make such a drastic change. And we've got it in consideration. The Rockets are always going to be less prone to changes than what the general fandom public is going to ask for, because we live and die more on each, or the fan base lives and dies more on each and every game than what the coaching staff does and what the Rockets structure does. So they're going to be less reactive. Even being overreactive, I don't think it's justified to change it too much right now. If they lose against the Pelicans and they lose against the Raptors, and all of a sudden a 506-game stretch turns into a 3-5 8-game stretch, at that point I start considering, okay, if we look at the last 8 games, that's a significant stretch of the season. It's not working anymore. At that point, I'd be down for more major changes. But truth is, up until that point, you can give more reps to Jalen, you can incorporate more, just because in getting more reps to Jalen doesn't fix it, but it's more like, well, it's not working with Fred either. And the only positive that Fred VanVleet gives to this team right now, the only positive is that he takes care of the ball and he's not as turnover prone as some of the other guys. Just from the fundamentals, just the dribbling, the way he positions his body to prevent steals from happening, the way he's not careless with the ball, all of those little things. That's what Fred is giving to the team. I don't even think he's been above replacement within the team defensively. I don't think he's been that great on that side either. But that stability matters, and you've got, for the totality of the season, the current version of the Rockets is a winning formula. The goal is not to win a championship this year. The goal is to make, to me, the goal is, it was to make the playoffs via the play-in or not. Right now, to me, the goal is get the 6th. To me, the reasonable goal should be get the 6th seed and get into the playoffs without meeting the play. To me, that's a successful season. They are on pace to do that. And if they're on pace to do that, why change it? The upside is not there for us to consider a major change that has downside, listen, it's not like any in-house change is going to turn this team from a solid playoff team to a contender. But a major change may turn this team, especially with the West being as competitive as it is, a major change may turn this team from what it is looking like right now, a 3, 4, 5, 6 seed, back into a team that's fighting for the 8, 9, 10 spots. And that's me a big downgrade. And so and hopefully it doesn't happen, up until it is shown to me that going through Fred and Jalen the way they currently have been going is not working well enough for us to be one of those top 6 seeds, I will say stay the course and hope that, because there's the other angle of it as well. Fred is very much below his career averages. Şengün, the same thing. It is expected that there will be some bounce back just by the law of averages from those two guys, and that will change a lot of the calculus for the Rockets. Jalen has basically been at what he is for his entire career, but then even the other guys, listen, Jabari is not shooting lights out from three. Dylan is not that much above what he was last year for the Rockets. He's probably the only one that you might argue that is overperforming, but even then, a man, he's getting better. I don't think he's better than last season, obviously, but the young players, they get better. Tari is below his career 3-point percentage. It's not like you're this good because some guys are underperforming, but the other guys are overperforming to make up for it. No, I truly believe that we're actually better than this, but we have some guys, a couple of really important guys in Fred and Amen that are currently underperforming. And so there is the argument that you stay the course and you hope that it bounces back, because it eventually, by the law of average should, unless you think that Fred is washed and that Şengün first last year was a mirage.
And one other point I want to add real quickly here. So this is not, and most of our audience should know this, but I just want to remind people, this is not a James Harden, I am the system player, and Fred VanVleet. He is open to a different role. It's not like you only can use him this way, or then he's going to be unhappy. And if you're going to do a change, you have to plan it out carefully and methodically, or else it's not going to take. No, we've seen over the past month, when Jalen has it going, Fred has pretty gracefully taken on a secondary role. Those games that Jalen went off, the Sixers game, the Kings, the Clippers, when they didn't have Harden. And, I mentioned Jalen seems to do this a little bit more against lesser opponents. So maybe this next week's a time this was likely to happen anyway. But it's not like Fred is someone you have to, change his role very carefully and decisively, or else he's not going to accept it. No, he's a team player, and if Jalen gets going, I think Fred on the fly will adjust very quickly. And so perhaps that plays into what you've been saying as well, which is that because Fred isn't someone that has a big ego that's going to, react terribly if in a given game things aren't going his way, maybe you just continue to stay the course largely. And if Jalen comes out hot against the Pelicans or the Hornets, a team like that, then the situation resolves itself and Jalen's being used the way he was in those games that I just mentioned, right?
Yes, and something that I missed on my earlier comment, which you touched on, the long-term viability of Fred as a Rocket, unless it turns out that there's no resurgence or no progression to the mean, I think and even if there is, I think there's a close to zero chance that Fred VanVleet's not on the Rockets next season, team option or not. You have to create the salary alive. You're not going to generate cap space with it. But I do think that the more likely scenario is that he turns down the option and gets extended for a lower average amount for 2 or 3 years. And this will be, since we're already an hour and 40 minutes deep, or nearly 40 minutes deep, I will leave this nugget. I will pick back up as we get closer and there's less stuff to talk about. We'll talk about this, I guess. I think it's very likely that some of the vets have their contracts extended for one more season. Give Jeff Green one more season, give Steven Adams one more season. Orlando has already that into his contract, but Jay can take the same thing. The Rockets are going to want to keep salary alive so they can make that trade. You heard the news came out today that the Rockets could look to flip some of their expiring star players that could help or that will fit the team better. Don't discard the option of trading for someone just because they have salary next year, or just extending guys that we currently have. Steven Adams is extension eligible, I'm pretty sure. And Kishan take the same thing for one more season just to keep that salary alive. Because the Rockets, and to me, this is one of the biggest giveaways that Tillman is not what people label as cheap as you could argue that he was back in the Arden days. The Rockets are going to operate very close to the tax line, and they're going to want to keep salary alive up to the tax line in order to be able to make a move for a star without giving up key players right now, without giving up Dylan Brooks, for example. And in order to do that, even if you decrease Fred's salary, say from 40, where it currently is, to 25, you're going to need to keep the other 15 alive as salary as ideally expiring salary by extending some of the other guys. And then you offset that amount with Jalen's extension kicking in and Alperen Şengün's extension kicking in. Don't have the numbers right now, but it's to me, the most likely scenario is that they renegotiate the contract with Fred, they decline and extend. And there's a real possibility that with that number in mind, that those negotiations might even be happening right now, because it would make sense for the Rockets to know what the salary they will need to complement the decrease in salary in Fred's salary next year would be. So just to say, it long term, it makes no sense for the Rockets to just let Fred VanVleet go. He's at his current salary, he isn't, but he is worth keeping around. He's still a good player, and it makes sense from a financial standpoint as well. So I know it's very easy to get caught up in the moment and say, "Oh, please get rid of this guy. This guy isn't good anymore." From a financial standpoint, it makes all the sense in the world to keep him. From a locker room management standpoint, makes sense as well. And even on the court, if you do make a trade, let's say it's a Jalen Green based trade for another star guard, Fred VanVleet's a guy that you can easily play next to another star guard because of his catch and shoot ability, and someone that you can bring off the bench as a sixth man to lead the second unit as he, as his career draws closer to its end as he ages.
Yeah, the last point I'll make on this discussion, you don't want to have a situation where you're asking the tail to wag the dog, and if you make too drastic of a change simply based on the theoretical idea that, hey, if we initiate more offense through Jalen Green or Amen Thompson, then this is going to benefit him and the team. He's going to get in more rhythm, especially with a guy who's fairly low maintenance to begin with in Fred and is open to being used differently on the fly if the situation warrants it for the team. Why wouldn't you, there's a few little things you can do, but to me, the more I think about it, it makes more sense to go back to the meritocracy framing, the way I think Ime Udoka has largely run things since he took the job prior to last season, and maybe it resolves itself anyway because it's a weaker stretch of the schedule. Jalen tends to go off against a lot of those matchups, especially when teams are hurt, and so he can use his speed, his athleticism a bit more, and it's more powerful. And in that case, you resolve the situation anyway because Jalen will take on the increased reps just on his own merit, and Fred will be okay with that, just as he was in Philadelphia and in Sacramento and in LA against the Clippers. You don't have to force a move because of what you think theoretically might happen. You can do a little thing different here and there, but you can also let the situation resolve itself through merit. And if Jalen proves worthy of it the same way he has, it's maddeningly inconsistent, but there have been good games. If he does that, then perhaps the situation resolves itself organically, if you will, to spin it full circle to the Stephen Silas years. Anyway, we'll wind down the pod here because, as Paolo mentioned, we're about an hour and 40 minutes in now. This is one of our longer shows, but boy, we covered a lot of ground today, and we went on a little bit longer with the Texans hypothetical, Rockets-Texans hypothetical, that is, than I expected to going into the show. After we wrap up, quick prediction from each of us. These next 4 games, Pelicans twice, Raptors, and Hornets. My call, and this is probably gutsy, I'm saying 4-0. I think on paper, they'll be favored by a decent amount in all those games. Now, you worry about the potential for a letdown in one of them, But I think, the Rockets are going to want to make amends for the way they've played offensively of late. They're going to be incentivized. They're going to have fresh legs. And here's the thing, of those 4 games, on paper, what looks like the most daunting is Charlotte on night 2 of a back-to-back. But I think they're going to take that game especially seriously on Monday because of what happened in October, because of that season-opening loss. I think Charlotte will have their attention in a way that normally the Hornets on night 2 of a back-to-back might not. And if you get that Charlotte game, then the Hornets and Pelicans, all with 2 days of rest going into those games, at least 2 days of rest, more than that in the case of the Pelicans, I just struggle to see the Rockets losing any of those games. So it sounds aggressive, but I'm going 4-0 over this next week stretch between the 19th and the 26th. What's your call?
I'm with you. I'm going for a no.
Ooh.
I think being so defensive oriented, and not to make a very long-winded point about this, I think it decreases our
Variance.
decreases our variance. Exactly. And so I don't think we'll blow any of these teams out, or we may once or twice, but I think they'll be, within 10, 15 points the entire time, sometimes less, sometimes more. And it won't feel like we easily beat these teams, but that's because we don't easily beat teams in general. That's just the type of game that we play. If we shoot or make a lot of threes, they're not going to blow teams off that easily, unless you literally score your 100 and you hold them to under 80, which is really tough in the NBA. So I think we'll beat all 4, but it won't feel as easy as it would for a team like the Celtics or the Thunder, that would also beat these teams by far, but due to the difference in play styles, would do it more, I guess, convincingly. But I do think we'll take care of business. And I think when comparing us to a team like the Celtics or the Thunder, I think it's less likely that we'll suffer an upset than it is that they will suffer an upset just because of variance. But at the same time, when we do win, we won't do it by a lot.
Yeah, and if that happens, the Rockets would be 21-9 through 30 games. Nice round number. And it would actually be at that point on a 57.4 win pace at the 30-game mark. That would be pretty amazing. And the schedule gets a little more difficult after that with a homestand against the Timberwolves, the Heat, the Mavs, the Celtics, the Lakers. But those are in Houston, where, again, Rockets are 10-3 this season, actually a 63-win pace inside of Toyota Center. So even as the schedule gets a little more difficult, that's offset by, I believe, your longest homestand of the entire season right after Christmas. So even if it feels like these matchups aren't nearly as sexy as the ones we just saw in the NBA Cup, yeah, there's a lot to play for, because especially if you can go 4-0, and I agree with your point that defense sort of decreases the variance. The Rockets aren't as dependent on shot luck with their formula. I'm sure some will point out that, well, early in the season, they did have some bad losses to actually the Hornets among them. I think what's changed is that at the start, the Rockets, they felt like they had a pretty good defense, and that was obviously something they wanted to be their calling card. I think now, especially going up against all these great opponents, and it's still translating, the Rockets know they have a great defense. It's not theoretical. They believe that they are the first or second best defense in the NBA. And so with that comes a lot more confidence. You're less likely to have a bad night on that side. And I just think that a team that's built with that as its centerpiece, I agree with your framing. It's less likely for a brutal upset. You might be more likely for moderate upsets in that, a team that's good enough to be within 4 or 5 points of you in the spread if they have a hot shooting night and you don't have the offense to overcome it. But if you're going up against teams that on paper you'll probably be favored by 8, 9, 10 plus points against, then yeah, that's where being a truly elite defensive team with a lot of depth and rest on top of it in these games, that's where I think you should really have an advantage. And so that's why, even if it sounds aggressive, I'm going 4-0 as well. And if that's the case, then we'll be talking right after Christmas about a 21-9 basketball team on a pace to win 57 plus games, which would be absolutely crazy. So yeah, to go back to where we started the pod, or got to midway, I know we started with the Texans comps, but I started my rant with why I think some of the current pessimism in the discourse is overcooked. Yeah, if they get to the 30-game mark and they're tracking for upper 50s, how can you not love what this season is about here in Houston? Anyway, we've gone on long enough, so I will wrap it here. And if you want more content before that next show, which will be right around Christmas, then the best place to get that is online. You can follow me on Twitter X at Ben Dubose, Paolo at Paolo Alves NBA, and the show at The Logger Line, where if you go to The Logger Line's page, then you can find our link tree. That's got links to distribution partners, Apple, Google, Spotify. You can just subscribe, leave a positive review at your location of choice. Obviously, we would appreciate that. And also on that same link tree, you've got links to friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Bar, Carback Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Hit those links. Please consume their content as well. All right, with those plugs complete, we'll adjourn for tonight. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another episode of The Logger Line. Go Rockets.